You can watch everything and still miss the one moment that matters. The screen glowed in cold grayscale as Roman DeLuca stood alone in his office, the city stretching miles beyond the glass behind him, his hand frozen halfway to his drink while the security feed flickered to life once more. And there she was again, the maid he barely remembered hiring, kneeling beside his daughter's bed like she belonged there. Like the room full of machines and quiet tension did not intimidate her at all. Like the silence that had swallowed his home for months had never existed in the first place. And for a second, just 1 second, Roman forgot to breathe as he watched Sophie's small, trembling hand reach out and cling to the fabric of the maid's sleeve as if it were the only thing tethering her to this world. Because that had never happened before, not for the doctors, not for the specialists flown in from 3 different states, not for the nurses who followed every instruction down to the decimal point, not even for him, her own father, who had built an empire on control and precision and certainty, yet could not command his daughter to open her eyes or take another sip of water when the fever came. And now this girl, this nobody, was speaking to Sophie in a voice so soft the microphone barely caught it. Something about staying, something about not being alone. Words so simple Roman almost dismissed them until he saw the way Sophie's fingers tightened just slightly, just enough to send a ripple through his chest that felt dangerously close to hope. A feeling he had buried the night the hospital lights went dim and silence replaced the sound of his wife's breathing, a silence that had followed him home and settled into every corner of this house like a permanent shadow. And that was the night he installed the cameras, not just for security, not just because of the life he lived and the enemies he had, but because he needed to see everything, every second, every movement, every breath Sophie took when he wasn't there, because losing sight of her, even for a moment, felt like inviting fate to take her too. And so he watched, always watched, from the polished darkness of his office or the quiet of his car or the stillness of the long hallway outside her room. And yet nothing he watched ever changed, not until tonight. Not until this girl with tired eyes and steady hands sat beside his daughter, as if she understood something no one else did, and Roman's jaw tightened as he leaned closer to the screen, analyzing every movement the way he would analyze a negotiation, a threat, a betrayal, because that was the world he knew, the only language he trusted, and this was unfamiliar territory, a space where control slipped through his fingers and something softer tried to take its place. Something he did not trust, could not afford to trust, because softness had cost him once before, and it had taken everything. So he told himself it was coincidence, that Sophie's hand moving was nothing more than a reflex, that the slight easing in her expression meant nothing, that the maid's presence was irrelevant. But even as the thought formed, he replayed the footage, again and again and again, watching the exact moment Sophie turned her face just enough to rest against the girl's arm. Watching the way the girl adjusted the blanket without hesitation, without fear, as if she had done it 100 times before, as if this wasn't a job, but something deeper, something rooted in instinct rather than instruction, and Roman felt something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable, like a crack forming in a wall he had spent years building, and he didn't like it. Didn't like the way his attention kept returning to her instead of the monitors, didn't like the way he found himself waiting, for her to speak again, for Sophie to respond again, for something to happen that he could not predict or control. And when the girl finally lifted her head, brushing a strand of hair back with emotion so absent-minded it felt intimate, Roman straightened, his expression hardening instantly, as if she might somehow sense him watching, as if the distance between them meant nothing, as if she could step out of that screen and stand in front of him and see right through the armor he wore so effortlessly in every other part of his life. And the thought irritated him, more than it should have, enough that he reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact list where her name sat like an afterthought. Elena Hayes, temporary staff, no background worth noting, no credentials beyond basic references, no reason to matter, and yet she did, in a way he couldn't explain, because his daughter, his silent, distant, fragile daughter, had just held on to her like she mattered more than anything in that room. And Roman DeLuca did not believe in accidents. He did not believe in luck, and he certainly did not believe in miracles. But as he stared at the screen one more time, watching Elena lean closer and whisper something too quiet to hear, He felt the first unsettling question rise in his mind, slow and deliberate, a question he could not silence no matter how hard he tried. Because if she could do what no one else had done, then who exactly had he let into his home? Roman did not sleep that night, not because he could not, but because he chose not to. Look away as the footage looped quietly in front of him, the soft glow of the monitors reflecting in his eyes while the rest of the house remained still and obedient to silence. And every few minutes he told himself to stop, to turn the screen off, to trust that nothing would change, but his hand never moved, because something had already changed and he had seen it with his own eyes. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Not the way Sophie's fingers had curled into Elena's sleeve, not the way her breathing had steadied under the gentle rhythm of that quiet voice. And certainly not the way Elena had remained there long after the machine settled, sitting on the edge of the bed as if time itself had slowed around her, as if she understood that leaving too soon would undo everything she had just begun. And Roman leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he watched her adjust the blanket once more, smoothing it down with care that felt deliberate rather than rehearsed. And it unsettled him in a way he could not name, because care was not something he associated with precision, and precision was the only thing that had ever kept him from losing control. And yet here she was, doing something no protocol had managed to achieve, and doing it without asking permission, without reporting to anyone, without even looking at the camera that recorded every second of her presence, as if she did not need an audience, as if she did not fear being watched. And that, more than anything, made Roman's jaw tighten slightly, because everyone feared being watched in his world. Everyone adjusted their behavior when they knew eyes were on them. But Elena Hayes moved like someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and that made her dangerous in a way he had not anticipated, because unpredictability was the one variable he refused to tolerate. And yet he did not call security, did not send someone to remove her from the room, did not interrupt the moment unfolding in front of him. Instead, he reached forward and slowed the footage down, watching again the exact second Sophie's expression shifted, analyzing it frame by frame as if there were a hidden mechanism behind it, something he could isolate and replicate, something he could control. But there was nothing, no visible trigger, no measurable cause, just a quiet exchange between a sick child and a woman who spoke to her like she still belonged to the world outside those walls. And Roman exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the desk before he finally stood, the decision forming without ceremony as he stepped out of his office and into the long corridor that led towards Sophie's room, the polished floor reflecting the dim lights above while the house remained wrapped in that familiar stillness. And with each step his expression hardened again, the brief crack in his composure sealing itself as instinct took over, because whatever this was, whatever Elena Hayes had introduced into his carefully controlled environment, he needed to see it up close, not through a screen, not filtered by cameras and silence, but in real time, in the same space where his daughter lay fighting a battle he could not fight for her. And when he reached the door he paused, just for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering near the handle as the faint sound of Elena's voice carried through the wood, softer now, almost a whisper meant only for Sophie. And something in that sound made him hesitate in a way that irritated him immediately, because hesitation was weakness, and weakness had no place in the life he had built. And yet it lingered just long enough for him to notice that the house no longer felt entirely cold, that the air outside that room carried a trace of something unfamiliar, something warmer, something he had not allowed himself to feel since the day everything changed. And his jaw tightened again as he pushed the door open without warning, stepping inside with the quiet authority that had always commanded attention the moment he entered any room. But this time, the reaction he expected did not come, because Elena did not flinch, did not scramble to stand, did not look startled or afraid. She simply turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze with calm eyes that held neither challenge nor submission. And for a second the room seemed to hold its breath, the monitors humming softly in the background while Sophie remained still, her small hand still wrapped loosely in the fabric of Elena's sleeve. And Roman's eyes moved from the maid to his daughter and back again, measuring, calculating, searching for something he could define, something he could control. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying the weight of authority that had shaped every part of his life. Yet beneath it, barely perceptible, there was something else, something quieter, something that had no place in a man like him. "What exactly are you doing?" And Elena did not look away, did not rush to explain, did not fill the silence with excuses the way others always did. She simply glanced down at Sophie for a brief moment, adjusting the blanket once more before answering in a tone that was steady and unhurried. "I am making sure she does not feel alone." And the simplicity of the answer landed harder than any elaborate explanation could have, because it was not technical, not procedural, not something he could quantify or replicate. And Roman felt that same unfamiliar tension tighten in his chest again as he studied her face, searching for signs of pretense, for any indication that she was performing, that this was an act designed to gain favor or security. But there was nothing, just quiet certainty, and it unsettled him more than defiance ever could, because defiance, he understood, it had rules, consequences, boundaries. But this was something else entirely. And as Sophie's fingers tightened just slightly again, a barely noticeable movement that would have gone unseen if he had not been watching so closely, Roman realized with a clarity that left no room for denial that whatever Elena Hayes was doing, it was reaching his daughter in a way he had failed to do. And for the first time since he installed the cameras, he began to question whether watching everything had ever truly meant understanding anything at all. Roman did not respond immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because the one forming in his mind did not fit the version of himself he had spent years perfecting. And for a brief moment the silence between them stretched into something unfamiliar, something that did not obey hierarchy or authority, and it irritated him more than it should have. So he stepped further into the room, the soft sound of his shoes against the polished floor breaking whatever fragile stillness had settled there. And Elena watched him without tension, without anticipation, as if his presence did not alter the space the way it always did for everyone else. And that alone made him more aware of every detail, the steady rhythm of the monitor, the faint rise and fall of Sophie's chest, the way Elena's hand remained gently anchored beneath his daughter's fingers, as if she understood that even the smallest shift could pull her back into that distant place she had been trapped in for months. And Roman's gaze moved to Sophie again, sharper now, searching for any sign that what he had seen earlier was fading, that this moment was temporary. But it was not, because Sophie had not withdrawn, had not recoiled, had not turned away. Instead, her breathing remained steady, her small hand still curled in quiet insistence, and something inside him tightened again, not fear, not exactly, but something close enough to unsettle him, and he folded his arms slowly, anchoring himself in the only posture that had ever felt certain. "You are not medical staff," he said, his tone controlled, measured, the kind that did not invite contradiction. But Elena did not react the way most people would have. She did not rush to justify her presence or explain her role. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the obvious before answering in that same steady voice. "No, I am not." And Roman's eyes narrowed slightly, because that was not enough, not for him, not in a situation where every variable mattered. "Then you follow instructions," he continued, his gaze fixed on her, as if he could force compliance through sheer will. But again, she did not flinch, did not retreat, and when she spoke, there was no defiance in her tone, only quiet clarity. "I follow what helps her." And the simplicity of that statement landed with a weight that was difficult to ignore, because it bypassed the structure he relied on. It did not argue, did not challenge. It simply existed as truth in a way that left no room for negotiation. And Roman exhaled slowly, his patience thinning not because she had disrespected him, but because she had not engaged in the expected exchange at all, and that absence of friction made it harder to assert control, harder to define the boundaries he needed to maintain. And for a moment he considered removing her, ending whatever this was before it had the chance to disrupt anything further. But his gaze shifted again, almost against his will, back to Sophie. And there it was again, that small, undeniable sign, her fingers tightening just slightly, her expression softening in a way that had not happened in weeks, and the thought formed before he could stop it, sharp and unwelcome. If he removed Elena now, would Sophie close herself off again? Would that fragile connection disappear as quickly as it had appeared? And Roman did not like questions without answers. especially when those answers could cost him something. He was not willing to lose, and his jaw tightened as he turned his attention back to Elena, studying her more closely now, noticing the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way her posture remained relaxed, but attentive, as if she had learned to exist in difficult spaces without becoming rigid. And he realized then that she was not performing for him, not adjusting her behavior under his scrutiny, because she had not expected him to be here at all, and that meant what he was seeing was real, unfiltered, and that realization shifted something in his assessment, subtle but significant, because authenticity was rare in his world, and when it appeared, it demanded attention, even when it was inconvenient, even when it challenged everything he relied on. And he moved closer to the bed, his presence casting a quiet shadow over the scene as he looked down at his daughter, his expression unreadable as he reached out, hesitating for the briefest fraction of a second before allowing his fingers to rest lightly against Sophie's wrist, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steady pulse beneath it. And for a moment the room narrowed to that single point of contact, that single confirmation, that she was still here, still fighting, still holding on. And when he lifted his gaze again, it met Elena's once more, and this time there was no immediate command, no instruction, just a measured silence that carried more weight than words. Because for the first time since she had entered his home, Roman DeLuca was not deciding what to do with her. He was trying to understand her, and that shift, however small, changed the balance of the room in a way neither of them acknowledged, and after a moment he withdrew his hand, straightening slightly as the familiar mask of control settled back into place. But it was not as solid as it had been before, not as absolute. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, but no less deliberate. "You will report directly to me from now on." And Elena tilted her head just slightly, considering his words for a brief moment before answering, not with submission, but with quiet agreement that carried its own terms, if it helps her. And Roman held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, the tension between them no longer defined by authority alone, but by something more complex, something that had no clear structure. And as he turned to leave, his steps measured and controlled, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his chest that this was not a temporary disruption. This was the beginning of something he had not planned for, something he could not fully control. And as the door closed softly behind him, the house did not feel as cold as it had before. And that was the most unsettling change of all. Roman returned to his office before the first light of morning touched the skyline. But the room no longer felt like the place he had left just hours before, because something from that quiet bedroom had followed him back, something he could not shut off or file away. And for the first time in years, the screens in front of him did not feel like tools of control, but like windows into something he did not fully understand. And he stood there for a long moment without moving, his gaze fixed on the live feed as Elena remained beside Sophie, her presence steady, unchanging, as if she had no intention of stepping away. Even when the rest of the house slowly began to wake, and Roman felt that same tension settle into his chest again, not sharp, not immediate, but persistent, like a question that refused to be ignored, and he reached for the console, pulling up the additional camera angles without thinking, watching from the doorway, from the corner, from the ceiling, mapping the room the way he always did, tracking movement, measuring patterns, searching for inconsistencies. But there were none, because Elena moved with the same quiet purpose no matter where the lens was positioned, never rushing, never hesitating. And that consistency unsettled him more than unpredictability ever could, because it meant this was not instinct alone. This was something deeper, something practiced, something learned. And Roman's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned closer to the screen, noticing details he had overlooked before. The way Elena adjusted Sophie's pillow not once but twice, making sure the angle supported her breathing. The way she checked the temperature of the water before offering it, not relying on assumption but verifying with care. And the way she spoke, always low, always steady, never filling the silence unnecessarily, as if she understood that too many words could overwhelm a child who had already retreated too far inside herself. And Roman exhaled slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the desk as he replayed a small moment he had nearly missed, Sophie shifting slightly, just enough for Elena to pause whatever she was doing and respond without delay. not because of a machine alert, not because of a schedule, but because she was paying attention in a way that could not be programmed. And something in that realization pressed against him again, harder this time, because he had built an entire system around anticipation and response, around preventing every possible failure, and yet none of it had achieved what this one woman was doing with nothing but presence and patience. And the thought irritated him, not because he resented her, but because it exposed a flaw he had not accounted for, a gap in his control that could not be filled with more surveillance or stricter rules. And he straightened slightly, the familiar edge returning to his posture as he reminded himself of what mattered: Sophie's condition, her stability, her progress. And if Elena Hayes was contributing to that, then her presence would be managed, structured, integrated into the system in a way that maintained order, because that was how he handled every variable, every asset, every risk. And yet, even as he formed that plan, his gaze drifted back to the screen, lingering longer than necessary as Elena reached for a small book on the bedside table, opening it with one hand while her other remained loosely held by Sophie. And she began to read, her voice soft but clear enough to carry through the audio feed. The words simple, unremarkable on their own, but the effect immediate, because Sophie's breathing slowed further, her expression easing in a way that could not be mistaken, and Roman felt something shift again, quieter this time, almost reluctant, because it did not align with anything he had trained himself to recognize. And for a brief moment he allowed himself to watch without analyzing, without breaking the moment into components, just observing the way the room seemed to settle around that voice. The way the tension he had grown accustomed to was replaced by something gentler, something he had not seen in this house since before everything changed, and the realization lingered longer than he expected, long enough for him to become aware of it, long enough for him to question it. And that was when the discomfort returned, sharper now, because he did not like not understanding, did not like the way his attention had shifted from control to observation, from command to something dangerously close to dependence. And he turned away from the screen abruptly, pacing once across the length of the office as if movement alone could restore the balance he had lost. But it did not, because the image remained fixed in his mind: Elena's steady presence, Sophie's quiet response, the absence of fear where there had once been nothing but resistance. And Roman stopped at the window, looking out over the city that had always responded to his decisions without hesitation, a world that moved according to the structures he understood. And for a moment he anchored himself in that certainty, in the familiar weight of authority, in the knowledge that everything outside those walls still obeyed the rules he had mastered. But when he turned back to the monitors, that certainty did not follow him, because inside that room, something was changing without his permission, without his direction. And for the first time, he did not immediately move to stop it. Instead, he stepped closer to the screen again, his gaze settling on Elena as she closed the book and adjusted the blanket once more, her movements as quiet and deliberate as before. And he realized with a clarity that left no room for denial that he was no longer just monitoring her presence. He was studying it, trying to understand how someone with no authority, no power, no obligation beyond a temporary role could shift the atmosphere of an entire house simply by refusing to treat it like a place defined by loss. And as Sophie's fingers tightened again, more noticeable this time, a small but undeniable sign of connection, Roman felt that same question rise again, stronger now, more insistent, not about what Elena was doing, but about what he had been missing all along. And as the morning light finally began to creep into the room through the high windows, casting a faint glow over the monitors, he remained exactly where he was, watching, not because he needed to, but because for the first time in a long time, he wanted to see what would happen next. By the time the house fully awakened, Roman had already rewritten the rules in his mind, not on paper, not in commands passed through staff or security, but in the quiet recalibration of what he allowed and what he no longer interrupted. And it was a change so subtle no one would have recognized it. Yet it altered everything, because for the first time since the cameras were installed, he did not issue a single correction when Elena adjusted the routine, did not send a message when she delayed medication by a few minutes to calm Sophie first, did not intervene when she replaced silence with soft conversation that held no measurable value yet seemed to steady the room in ways his systems never had. and Roman stood in the doorway again that morning, not hidden this time, not behind glass or distance, but present, watching with the same intensity he had always carried, only now directed towards something he could not reduce to numbers or outcomes. And Elena noticed him immediately, not with surprise, not with tension, just a brief glance that acknowledged his presence before returning her attention to Sophie, and that quiet dismissal of his authority should have irritated him, should have demanded correction, yet it did not, because Sophie was awake, not fully, not with the energy of a healthy child, but enough that her eyes remained open for longer than a few seconds, enough that her gaze followed Elena's movement instead of drifting back into that unreachable place, and Roman felt that same unfamiliar shift again, deeper now, harder to ignore, as he stepped into the room without announcing himself, his presence filling the space in a way it always had, except now it did not disrupt the fragile balance that had formed, and he stopped beside the bed, his eyes fixed on Sophie, as if confirming what he was seeing was real. Because for months her eyes had avoided everything, had refused connection, and now they lingered, faintly, quietly, on the person beside her, and Elena spoke again, her voice low, steady. "Good morning, Sophie." As if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if mornings in this room had never been defined by silence and resistance, and Sophie did not respond with words, but her fingers moved again, a small shift, a barely noticeable tightening that would have gone unseen if Roman had not been watching as closely as he always did, and something inside him tightened with it. Not fear this time, not uncertainty, but something more dangerous, something that felt like the beginning of belief, and he did not like it, because belief meant expectation, and expectation had cost him too much once before, so he forced his attention back to structure, to control, to the measurable details he trusted. "Her medication schedule," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet with controlled precision, and Elena nodded slightly, not turning fully toward him. "She will take it," she replied, her tone calm, "but not like this," and Roman's jaw tightened instinctively, the familiar tension returning as he looked at the untouched tray beside the bed, every element placed exactly where it should be, every instruction followed perfectly, and yet Sophie had refused it all, and he knew this pattern, had seen it too many times, and the part of him that relied on certainty pushed forward again. "It is not optional," he said, the authority in his voice sharpening slightly, but Elena did not react with submission, did not rush to comply. Instead, she reached for the glass, testing the temperature again before placing it closer, not forcing, not demanding, just offering, and she leaned closer to Sophie, her voice lowering just enough to shift the moment into something private, something Roman could hear but not fully enter. "You can choose when," she said gently, "but you cannot choose to give up." And the words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, but carrying a weight that Roman felt even from where he stood, because they were not instructions, not commands, they were something else. Entirely, something that invited response instead of enforcing it. And for a moment nothing happened, the silence stretching just enough for Roman to feel that old frustration rise again, the instinct to step in, to take control, to force the outcome he needed, but he did not move, did not interrupt, because something in Elena's stillness held him there. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sophie's hand shifted, releasing the fabric of Elena's sleeve just enough to move toward the glass. Not fully, not confidently, but enough to change the direction of the moment, and Roman felt it like a shock through his system, a reaction he could not suppress as his gaze locked onto that small movement, because it was not compliance, it was not forced, it was a choice, however fragile, however incomplete, and Elena did not rush it, did not celebrate it. She simply remained where she was, steady, present, allowing Sophie the space to continue, and after a few seconds that felt longer than they should have, Sophie's fingers touched the glass, hesitated, then curled around it with faint determination, and Roman exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath, the sound quiet but noticeable in the stillness. And for the first time since he had stepped into the room, Elena turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding a quiet certainty that did not seek approval, did not ask permission, and in that moment Roman understood something he had resisted from the beginning, something that no amount of surveillance had revealed, That control had kept his daughter alive, but it had not helped her live, and as Sophie lifted the glass just enough to take the smallest sip, barely more than a fraction, Roman felt that shift inside him settle into something real, something undeniable, and when he looked back at Elena, the question he had been holding no longer felt like a threat, but like something else entirely, something that might finally have an answer. And he realized that for the first time, he was not watching her to find a flaw, he was watching to understand how she had done what he could not. The moment did not end when Sophie lowered the glass. It lingered in the air like something fragile that no one dared disturb, and Roman remained exactly where he was, his gaze fixed on that small, impossible shift as if looking away might undo it. While Elena did not react with triumph or relief, she simply adjusted the blanket again, her movements as steady as before, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. And that quiet restraint unsettled him more than any display of emotion could have, because it meant she was not chasing outcomes, she was creating space for them. And Roman found himself watching her hands more closely now, the way they moved without hesitation yet without force, the way she anticipated Sophie's smallest changes as if she had learned to read something deeper than symptoms. And he realized with a slow, reluctant clarity that what he had dismissed as instinct was something far more deliberate, something built on understanding rather than control, and the thought pressed against him again. Uncomfortable in its simplicity, because it suggested that everything he had built around Sophie, every system, every rule, every layer of protection, had been missing something essential, something that could not be installed or enforced, and he straightened slightly, the familiar tension returning to his posture as he forced his attention back to structure, to the world he understood, because allowing that thought to settle too deeply felt like stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place in his life. Yet even as he tried to reclaim that ground, his eyes moved again, almost against his will, to Elena, and he noticed something new, something he had not considered before, the way she never looked at Sophie with pity, never treated her like something fragile or broken, but also never ignored the reality of her condition, and that balance, that quiet respect, created a space where Sophie did not have to resist being seen, and Roman felt that realization settle heavier than the others, because it was not just about what Elena was doing, it was about what he had not been doing, and for a brief moment he saw the room as Sophie must have seen it, filled with expectations, with pressure, with the silent weight of everyone waiting for her to improve, to respond, to survive, and he understood why she had turned away, why she had retreated into that unreachable place where nothing was demanded of her, and the thought lingered longer than he expected, long enough to make him shift his stance slightly, long enough to make him step closer to the bed again, this time not as a figure of control, but as something else, something he had not allowed himself to be in a very long time, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, the edge softened just enough to change the tone of the room. "What did you say to her?" And Elena did not answer immediately, her attention still on Sophie as she waited for the small, slow movements that signaled the next step, and only when Sophie settled back against the pillow did she turn her head slightly, meeting Roman's gaze with that same steady calm. "Nothing complicated," she said, her voice low. "Just something she can hold on to." And Roman's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, because that answer did not satisfy the part of him that needed definition, needed clarity. "Be specific," he said, the command still present but no longer absolute. And Elena studied him for a brief moment, not as an employee would study an employer, but as someone measuring whether the truth would be heard or dismissed, and then she answered, "I told her she can choose when to try, but she cannot choose to disappear." And the words settled into the room with a weight that felt heavier than their simplicity suggested, and Roman felt something shift again, deeper this time, because it was not just about Sophie anymore. It was about him, about the way he had approached everything since the moment his world had changed, controlling every variable, watching every detail, ensuring nothing escaped his attention, yet never addressing the one thing he could not control, the fear that had settled into his daughter and kept her there. And he exhaled slowly, the sound quieter than before, almost unnoticed, as he looked down at Sophie again, her expression calmer now, her breathing steady, her small hand resting loosely against the blanket instead of clinging to anything. And for the first time, he did not reach for her immediately, did not try to re-establish contact. Instead, he watched, allowing the moment to exist without interference. And that alone felt like a shift, small but significant, because it meant he was no longer trying to force connection. He was allowing it to form, and Elena seemed to recognize that without acknowledging it directly. Her movements remaining unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had expected this transition all along. And Roman felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years, not confidence, not certainty, but something quieter, something that did not demand control to exist, and it unsettled him even as it held his attention. And after a moment he straightened again, the familiar structure returning to his posture, but not as rigid as before, not as absolute. And when he spoke this time, his voice carried less command and more intention. "You will stay on this assignment." And Elena tilted her head slightly, considering the words before answering. "I was planning to." And the simplicity of her response caught him off guard in a way he did not expect, because it removed the transaction from the equation, removed the sense that this was something she needed permission for. And Roman held her gaze for a second longer, measuring that difference, before nodding once, a small motion that carried more weight than it should have. And as he turned to leave, again, his steps slower this time, less driven by urgency and more by something he had not yet named, he realized that the house behind him no longer felt like a place defined entirely by loss. And that realization followed him down the hallway, settling into the quiet spaces he had grown used to, changing them in ways he could not yet fully understand, but could no longer ignore. The change did not announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, in the way the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath, in the way footsteps in the hallway did not echo as sharply as before, and Roman noticed it not all at once, but in fragments, small shifts that accumulated into something undeniable, because for the first time in months the routine inside Sophie's room no longer felt like a battle, and that unsettled him more than the silence ever had, because he did not know how to prepare for something that did not resist him. And yet every time he checked the monitors, every time he stood just outside the door, every time he entered the room under the pretense of oversight, he saw the same pattern repeating itself. Elena moving with that quiet certainty, Sophie responding in small but consistent ways, and the space between them growing into something that did not require force. And Roman found himself watching longer than necessary, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. And he did not like that feeling, because anticipation meant he was waiting for something he could not control, and control had always been the one thing he never surrendered. Yet here he was, standing in the doorway again as Elena sat beside the bed, holding a small piece of paper in her hand, something folded and worn at the edges as if it had been carried for a long time. And Roman's gaze sharpened immediately, his instincts returning as he stepped closer, his voice low but direct. "What is that?" And Elena glanced at the paper before answering, her tone unchanged. "A story," she said simply, and Roman's eyes narrowed slightly, because that was not an answer he could measure, not something he could categorize into the structure he relied on. And he crossed his arms slowly, watching as she unfolded the paper and began to read, her voice soft but steady, the words simple, almost childlike, yet delivered with a weight that made them feel intentional. And Sophie's gaze shifted again, faint but present, following the sound of Elena's voice instead of drifting away. And Roman felt that familiar tension rise again, not sharp, not immediate, but persistent, because he could not ignore the effect, could not dismiss the pattern. And as Elena continued, he noticed the way Sophie's breathing aligned with the rhythm of the story, the way her small fingers moved slightly against the blanket, as if responding to something deeper than the words themselves. And Roman stepped closer without realizing it, his focus narrowing as he tried to understand what he was seeing. And when Elena paused for a moment, allowing the silence to settle instead of rushing to fill it, Sophie made a small sound, barely more than a whisper, but enough to change everything. And Roman froze, his entire body going still, as if movement might break the moment. And Elena did not react with surprise, did not look at him for confirmation. She simply leaned slightly closer, her voice lowering just enough to meet Sophie where she was. "You remember that part," she said gently, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement, and Sophie's fingers tightened again. A small, undeniable response, and Roman felt it like a shift beneath his feet, something solid moving in a way that forced him to adjust, because this was no longer a single moment, no longer an isolated reaction. It was becoming something consistent, something real, and that realization pressed against him harder than anything before, because it meant this was not luck, not coincidence. It was something Elena was creating, something she was building piece by piece without asking for permission, without following the rules he had set, and he felt the instinct to intervene rise again, to take control of the situation before it moved beyond his reach. But it did not come with the same certainty as before. It hesitated, slowed, weakened by the evidence in front of him, and for the first time he did not act on it. Instead, he remained where he was, watching as Elena folded the paper again and placed it gently on the bedside table, her movements unhurried, her attention returning fully to Sophie as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred, and Roman's gaze lingered on the paper for a moment, something about it pulling at his focus in a way he could not explain, and he stepped closer to the table, reaching out without thinking as he picked it up, the edges soft from use, the handwriting uneven but careful, and he glanced at Elena briefly, expecting some form of reaction, but she did not stop him, did not question him. She simply watched with that same quiet calm, and Roman looked down at the paper, his eyes scanning the lines, recognizing immediately that this was not something written for display, not something crafted to impress, but something personal, something meant to be held rather than shown. And as he read, the words settled into him in a way he had not expected, simple phrases about staying, about not being alone, about finding a reason to keep going even when everything felt distant. And Roman felt that same shift again, deeper this time, because he understood then that this was not just for Sophie. It was something Elena carried with her, something she had needed at some point, and the realization changed the way he looked at her, not as an employee, not as a variable to be managed, but as someone who understood loss in a way he had not allowed himself to acknowledge in anyone else. And he lowered the paper slowly, his gaze returning to Sophie as she lay there, quieter now, calmer, her breathing steady, her presence no longer defined entirely by resistance. And Roman exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible, as he placed the paper back exactly where he had found it. And when he spoke, his voice carried less command than it ever had before. "Where did you learn this?" And Elena met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, direct, and heavier than anything he had expected. "From losing someone who could not stay." And the words settled into the room with a weight that changed everything. Because for the first time Roman saw not just what she was doing, but why she was doing it. And that understanding did not give him control. It took something from him instead, something he had relied on for years. And as he stood there, looking between Elena and his daughter, he realized that whatever was happening in this room was no longer something he could contain. And for the first time, he was not sure he wanted to. The words did not fade after Elena spoke them. They lingered in the air with a quiet weight that Roman could not dismiss. And for the first time since she had entered his home, silence did not feel like something he controlled. It felt like something he had stepped into without understanding, and he stood there longer than he intended, his gaze shifting briefly from Elena to Sophie and back again, as if trying to reconcile what he had just learned with everything he believed about the world he had built. Because loss, in his world, was something buried, something sealed away behind decisions and distance and control, never spoken of in simple terms, never carried openly like she had just done. And yet here she was, standing in the same room where his daughter had refused connection for months, speaking about loss as if it were not something to hide, but something to survive. And that difference unsettled him more than any defiance ever could, because it forced him to see the gap between what he had been doing and what Sophie had needed. And Roman exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible as he turned his attention back to the bed, watching the steady rise and fall of Sophie's breathing, watching the absence of tension in her small frame. And for a moment he allowed himself to remain there without speaking, without correcting, without shaping the moment into something familiar. And it was in that stillness that he noticed something else, something subtle but undeniable. Sophie was not just responding to Elena. She was beginning to anticipate her, her gaze shifting slightly before Elena moved, her fingers tightening before Elena adjusted the blanket. Small signs that would have meant nothing to anyone else. But to Roman they were impossible to ignore, because they indicated trust, something Sophie had not given to anyone in a very long time. And that realization pressed deeper than the others, because trust could not be commanded, could not be enforced, it had to be earned, and Roman had spent months trying to protect his daughter without realizing he had never given her a reason to trust him again. And the thought stayed with him as he finally stepped back, his posture straightening instinctively as he reassembled the control he relied on, but it no longer felt as absolute as it once had. And when he turned to leave, his steps were measured but slower, as if he were leaving something behind without fully understanding what it was, and the door closed softly behind him, sealing the room in quiet. Once more, but the silence outside felt different now, less oppressive, less final, and Roman walked down the hallway without looking at the monitors, something he had not done in months, because he no longer needed to confirm what was happening. He had seen it for himself, and that changed something fundamental, something that could not be undone by distance or distraction. And when he reached his office, he did not go to the screens immediately. He stopped at the window instead, looking out over the city that had always answered to him, that had always responded to his decisions with predictable precision. And for a moment he anchored himself in that certainty, in the structure he understood, in the life that had never required him to question his methods. But the image of Sophie's small hand reaching for that glass, the sound of Elena's voice carrying something he could not replicate, the weight of words spoken without hesitation, they did not fade. They remained, pressing against the edges of that certainty until it no longer felt complete, and Roman turned back to the room slowly, his gaze moving not to the main screen, but to the smaller monitor tucked to the side, the one that showed a single angle of Sophie's room without the overlays and data, just the quiet, unfiltered image. And he watched again, not analyzing, not breaking it down into components, but observing, and Elena was there, exactly as before, sitting beside the bed, her presence steady, her movements deliberate, and Sophie was still awake, not fully alert, not strong, but present, and that alone held his attention longer than anything else, because presence had been the one thing missing for so long. And as he watched, Elena reached for the folded paper again, not to read this time, but to place it gently into Sophie's hand, guiding her fingers around it without forcing, without expectation. And Sophie did not resist. She held it, loosely but intentionally, as if the object itself carried something she could not yet express. And Roman felt that same shift again, quieter now, less jarring but more persistent, because it was no longer a question of whether Elena was making a difference. It was a question of what that difference meant for everything he had believed about how to keep his daughter safe. And he leaned slightly closer to the screen, his focus narrowing not out of control, but out of something that felt unfamiliar, something that resembled curiosity more than authority. And that realization settled into him with a quiet intensity, because curiosity required openness, and openness had never been part of his strategy. Yet here he was, watching not to confirm, not to enforce, but to understand. And as Sophie's fingers tightened once more around the paper, her breathing steady, her presence anchored in a way that had not been possible before, Roman understood something he had resisted from the beginning, something that no system he built could replace, that survival was not just about keeping someone alive, it was about giving them something to hold on to. And for the first time since everything had changed, he did not feel the immediate need to intervene, to adjust, to control. He simply stood there, watching the moment unfold, and allowing it to exist without his direction. And that, more than anything else, marked the beginning of a change he could no longer deny. Roman did not realize when observation had turned into habit, only that by the time the evening settled over the city and the lights beyond his windows flickered to life one by one, he was already standing in the same place he had stood the night before, watching the same room, but seeing something entirely different. And the difference was not in the furniture or the machines, or even the quiet rhythm of Sophie's breathing. It was in the absence of that heavy stillness that had once defined every second inside those walls, because now there was movement, subtle, restrained, but present, and Roman's gaze followed it without effort, tracking the way Elena shifted in her chair, the way she leaned forward when Sophie stirred, the way she adjusted her voice to match the fragile state of the child before her. And it no longer felt like something he needed to analyze. It felt like something he was learning from. And that realization lingered longer than he expected, because learning required acknowledging that something existed beyond his control. And for a man who had built his entire life on eliminating uncertainty, that was not a comfortable position. Yet he did not turn away, did not retreat into the structure he understood. Instead, he stepped closer to the screen, his focus narrowing as Elena reached for the small tray again, the same tray that had been ignored so many times before. And this time she did not present it immediately, did not place it in Sophie's reach and wait for resistance. Instead, she set it aside, choosing instead to sit closer, her presence becoming the center of the moment rather than the task itself. And Roman watched as she spoke again, her words too soft to fully catch, but her tone unmistakable, steady, patient. And Sophie responded, not with movement at first, but with attention, her eyes remaining open, her gaze fixed, and that alone held Roman's attention. Because attention was the first step to everything that followed, and he leaned slightly forward, his hand resting against the edge of the console as if grounding himself in something tangible. And when Elena finally reached for the glass, she did not offer it immediately. She placed it within sight, within reach, but not as a demand. And Sophie's fingers moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, and Roman felt the shift before it completed. The same quiet tension building in his chest as he watched the small hand lift, hesitate, then continue. And when Sophie brought the glass to her lips without assistance, without guidance, Roman's breath caught. The reaction immediate and impossible to suppress, because this was no longer a single success, no longer an isolated moment. It was becoming a pattern, a progression, and he felt something inside him respond to it, something that had been dormant for longer than he cared to admit, something that did not belong to the man he had become, but to the man he had been before loss had rewritten everything. And he straightened slightly, the instinct to step in, to be part of the moment rising again. But it was different now, less about control and more about presence, and that difference held him back, kept him where he was as Elena remained still, allowing Sophie to complete the action on her own. And when the glass was lowered, when the small movement ended, Elena did not celebrate, did not acknowledge it as something extraordinary. She simply nodded once, a quiet affirmation that required no words, and Sophie's fingers relaxed slightly, not retreating, not closing off, just resting. And Roman felt that same shift again, deeper this time, more solid, because it was no longer fragile, it was building into something that could not be undone by a single moment of fear or resistance. And he realized then that what Elena was creating was not a solution, not a fix. It was a foundation, something that allowed Sophie to move forward without being pushed, without being forced. And that understanding changed the way he looked at everything that had come before, because it meant his approach, his methods, his relentless control had not been wrong, but they had been incomplete. And the thought settled into him with a weight that was difficult to ignore, because it required him to accept that he could not do this alone, that protecting Sophie was not the same as reaching her. And for the first time, that truth did not feel like failure. It felt like something else, something that held the possibility of change. And Roman turned away from the screen slowly, not because he needed distance, but because he no longer needed confirmation. He had seen enough, understood enough to know that what was happening in that room would continue whether he watched it or not. And that realization followed him as he stepped out into the hallway. The quiet of the house no longer oppressive but calm, and he moved without urgency, his steps measured but unhurried, until he found himself standing outside Sophie's door once more. And this time he did not hesitate, did not pause to listen. He opened it and stepped inside, his presence filling the room in the same way it always had. But the reaction was different, because Elena did not stop what she was doing, did not look to him for instruction, and Sophie did not withdraw, did not turn away. And Roman stood there for a moment, taking in the scene without immediately altering it. And when he moved closer, his steps were quieter than before, less imposing, as if he were adjusting to a space that no longer responded to force. And he reached the bedside, his gaze settling on Sophie. And for a brief moment their eyes met, not fully, not with the clarity he remembered, but enough to register, enough to hold. And something inside him shifted again, more profoundly than before. Because this was not observation, this was connection, however fragile, however incomplete. And he did not speak immediately, did not disrupt it. He simply remained there, allowing the moment to exist without pressure. And when he finally looked at Elena, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there before. She is changing. And Elena met his gaze with that same quiet certainty, her answer simple, but carrying a weight that settled deeper than any explanation. She is choosing to stay. And Roman held her gaze for a second longer, the meaning of those words settling into him with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And for the first time since everything had changed, he understood that survival was no longer the only goal. And that realization marked a shift he could not reverse, because it meant he was no longer just trying to keep his daughter alive. He was learning how to help her live again. The moment did not break when Roman spoke. It deepened, settling into something quieter and more fragile, as if the room itself had learned to breathe differently. And he remained beside the bed longer than he intended, his presence no longer forcing change but adjusting to it. And that alone marked a shift he could not ignore, because for the first time, he was not shaping the environment around Sophie. He was allowing it to exist without interference. And as he stood there, watching the faint movement of her fingers against the blanket, the slight rise of her chest, the way her gaze no longer drifted endlessly but lingered, even if only for seconds, he felt something unfamiliar take root. Not certainty, not control, but something quieter, something that required patience rather than precision. And that realization unsettled him, even as it held him there, because patience was not something he had ever needed in his world. Everything had always responded to decisiveness, to action, to force. And yet here, in this room, none of that applied. And he became aware of it with a clarity that pressed against him from all sides. Because Elena was not forcing Sophie forward. She was waiting for her to move, creating space instead of pressure. And Sophie was responding, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. And Roman watched it unfold in real time, no longer through a screen, no longer filtered or delayed, but present, immediate, undeniable. And he found himself adjusting his own stance, stepping slightly back, giving the space more room, as if instinctively understanding that his presence, if too heavy, could undo what was forming. And that awareness alone marked a change he had not planned for, because it meant he was no longer the center of the moment. He was part of it, and the difference carried weight he could not ignore. And Elena continued as she had before, her voice low, her movements measured, her attention unwavering. And Sophie followed, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that something had shifted beyond repair, beyond reversal. And Roman's gaze moved between them again, slower this time, less analytical, more reflective, as if he were beginning to understand not just what was happening, but why. And that understanding settled into him with a quiet intensity, because it meant acknowledging something he had resisted from the beginning. That control alone could not reach where Sophie had gone. That protection without connection left something essential untouched. And the thought lingered as he finally stepped back, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the bed before withdrawing. A small motion that would have gone unnoticed before, but now felt deliberate, as if he were testing the space between himself and his daughter without closing it completely. And Sophie did not pull away, did not retreat, her gaze remaining where it was, her presence steady. And that alone held his attention longer than anything else, because it was not resistance, it was not absence, it was something in between, something that could grow if given the chance. And Roman turned slightly, his attention shifting to Elena. And for the first time since she had entered his home, he did not look at her as a variable to be managed or a presence to be monitored. He looked at her as someone who had done what he could not. And that recognition carried a weight he did not immediately express. But it was there, in the way his posture eased just slightly, in the way his voice, when he spoke, carried less command and more intention. "You changed the pattern," he said, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as an observation. And Elena met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her answer simple. "She changed it," she replied, and the distinction settled into the space between them with quiet clarity, because it removed ownership from the outcome. It shifted the focus back to Sophie, to her choices, her responses, her presence, and Roman felt that shift more deeply than he expected, because it meant this was not something he could take control of, not something he could replicate through command. It was something that required allowing Sophie to move at her own pace, and that understanding pressed against the structure he had relied on for so long, forcing him to adjust in ways he had never needed to before. And he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet, almost reflective, as he looked back at his daughter once more, taking in the small changes that now felt significant, the absence of tension in her shoulders, the way her hand no longer clung but rested, the faint awareness in her gaze. And for the first time since everything had changed, he allowed himself to consider what might come next, not in terms of control or outcome, but in terms of possibility. And that thought lingered as he stepped away from the bed, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if he were leaving behind something he did not fully understand but no longer wanted to disrupt. And as he reached the door, his hand paused briefly on the handle, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because the room behind him was no longer the same space he had walked into days ago, and neither was he. And when he finally stepped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him, the quiet that greeted him did not feel empty. It felt waiting, and Roman stood there for a moment, his gaze unfocused as he processed the shift that had taken place, not just in his daughter, not just in the house, but in himself. And for the first time, that change did not feel like something to resist. It felt like something to understand. And as he turned and walked away, his steps measured but unhurried. He knew with a certainty that settled deeper than anything before that whatever was happening in that room was no longer something he could observe from a distance. It was something he would have to step into. Whether he was ready or not, the night did not arrive quietly. It pressed against the windows with a steady stillness that felt heavier than before. And Roman sensed the shift the moment he stepped back into the house after hours away, because the air inside carried a tension that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with uncertainty. And he moved through the hallway without hesitation, his instincts returning in a way they had not for days, sharp, alert, aware of something changing beyond his control. And when he reached Sophie's door, it was already open, the soft glow of the room spilling into the corridor, and he stepped inside without announcement, his gaze locking instantly onto the bed, onto the small figure lying there, and something in the stillness of her form made his chest tighten in a way that was immediate and undeniable, because the calm he had come to recognize was different now, heavier, less responsive. And Elena was there, already leaning forward, her hand resting lightly against Sophie's forehead, her expression focused but not panicked. And that difference held Roman in place for a fraction of a second, long enough to notice that she was not reacting with fear, she was responding with intention, and that alone kept him from breaking the moment with command. And he stepped closer instead, his voice lower than before, but edged with urgency. "What is happening?" And Elena did not look at him immediately. Her attention fixed on Sophie as she adjusted the blanket, her movements precise, her voice steady. "Her temperature is rising," she said quietly, "but she is not pulling away." And the distinction settled into Roman's mind with a clarity that surprised him, because it meant this was not a return to what had been. It was something else, something more complex. And he moved closer to the bed, his gaze scanning Sophie's face, the faint flush in her cheeks, the slower rhythm of her breathing, and the instinct to take control surged again, stronger this time, sharper, because this was familiar territory. This was where systems and protocols applied, where precision mattered. And he reached for the phone without hesitation, issuing instructions with quiet authority, his voice steady, controlled, calling for the medical team, for everything to be prepared. And the response came instantly, as it always did, because this was his world. This was where control functioned without question. But as he ended the call and turned back, Elena had not moved from her position, had not stepped away, had not deferred to the structure he had just set in motion. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her hand still resting lightly against Sophie's, her presence unchanged. And Roman felt that tension again, that pull between the world he controlled and the space she occupied. And for a moment it sharpened into something close to frustration, because both could not exist without conflict. And yet they did, side by side. and he watched as Elena leaned slightly closer, her voice lowering, not louder, not urgent, but steady. "Stay with me," she said softly, not as a command, but as an anchor, and Sophie's fingers moved again, slower this time, weaker, but still responsive, still present, and Roman saw it, saw the difference, saw that even in this moment, even as her body struggled, she was not retreating. She was not disappearing the way she had before, and that realization stopped him from interrupting, from overriding the moment with force, because this was not the same pattern. This was something that required balance, and the medical team arrived within minutes, their presence filling the room with quiet efficiency, their movements precise, their voices low but purposeful, and Roman stepped aside instinctively, allowing them space to work, his gaze never leaving Sophie, tracking every detail, every adjustment, every response. And yet, even as the structure he trusted unfolded, his attention returned again and again to Elena, because she had not stepped back, had not relinquished her place. Instead, she adjusted with the movement around her, staying close without interfering, her presence constant in a way that the rest of the room was not, and Roman recognized it then, not as defiance, not as disregard for protocol, but as something else, something that complemented the structure rather than conflicting with it. And that realization shifted his understanding in a way he had not expected, because it meant control and connection did not have to exist in opposition. They could exist together, if balanced correctly, and as the minutes passed, as the tension in the room slowly eased, as Sophie's breathing steadied once more, Roman felt that tightness in his chest loosen slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to register, and he exhaled slowly, the sound quieter than before, almost reflective, as the medical team finished their adjustments, confirming stability, stepping back with the same efficiency they had entered with, and when they left, the room settled again into a quieter rhythm. But it was not the same quiet as before. It was not empty. It was not tense. It was something steadier, something grounded, and Roman stepped closer again, his gaze fixed on Sophie as her fingers remained loosely wrapped around Elena's hand, not gripping, not clinging, just present, and that presence held more weight than any result he could have measured, and he looked at Elena then, not with authority, not with suspicion, but with something that had been building over time. Something that had no clear definition yet could not be denied. And when he spoke, his voice carried that shift, quieter, more deliberate. "She stayed," he said, and Elena met his gaze with that same calm certainty, her answer simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had just happened. "She is learning how." And Roman held her gaze for a moment longer, the meaning settling deeper than any explanation, because it was not just about Sophie anymore. It was about the process, the change, the space being created for something he had not known how to give. And as he looked back at his daughter, her breathing steady, her presence anchored, he understood with a clarity that left no room for denial that what had been built in this room was no longer fragile. It was becoming something stronger, something that could withstand moments like this without breaking. And that realization changed something fundamental in him. Because for the first time since everything had been taken from him, he was not just reacting, he was participating in something that might actually bring her back. And as the room settled into quiet once more, Roman remained where he was. Not because he needed to control what happened next, but because he did not want to step away from it. Anymore, the quiet that followed did not feel like relief. It felt like something steadier, something earned, and Roman remained by the bedside long after the room had settled, his gaze fixed on Sophie, as if confirming again and again that she was still there, still present, still choosing in small ways to remain. And the weight of that realization did not leave him. It deepened, settling into a place he had kept guarded for far too long. Because for the first time he was not just witnessing survival, he was witnessing resistance against surrender. And that difference carried more meaning than anything he had fought to control before. And Elena did not move away, did not step back now that the urgency had passed. She remained exactly where she had been, her hand still loosely held by Sophie, her presence unchanged as if the moment had not required her to become something else. And Roman noticed that too. Noticed that she did not shift between roles, did not harden under pressure or soften afterward. She simply remained constant, and that consistency held a kind of strength he had not accounted for. Because in his world, strength had always been defined by force, by decisiveness, by the ability to dominate a situation. And yet here, in this room, strength had taken on a different form, quieter, steadier, something that did not demand control, but still shaped everything around it. And Roman exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as he stepped closer again, his attention narrowing not out of instinct, but out of something more deliberate, and he reached out, not with the urgency that had defined his earlier actions, but with a controlled gentleness that felt unfamiliar, his fingers resting lightly against Sophie's hand. And for a moment nothing changed, nothing reacted, and then, slowly, her fingers shifted, not gripping, not clinging, but acknowledging, and that small movement settled deeper into him than anything that had come before, because it was not directed at Elena this time, it was directed at him, and Roman felt something inside him respond to that, something he had not allowed himself to feel since everything had changed, something that did not belong to control or authority, but to connection, and he did not move his hand away, did not rush to speak, he simply allowed the contact to exist, and Elena watched without interruption, her expression unchanged, her presence steady as always, but there was something in her stillness that acknowledged the moment without claiming it, and Roman understood that too, understood that she was not inserting herself into this connection, she was allowing it to form on its own, and that understanding settled into him with quiet clarity, because it meant this was no longer something she was creating alone. It was something he was now part of, and that realization carried weight he could not ignore, because it meant responsibility in a way he had not fully accepted before, not just to protect, not just to control, but to be present in a way that could not be delegated or monitored. And he looked at Sophie again, her breathing steady, her expression calmer than it had been in months, and he allowed himself to remain there, not measuring the moment, not calculating its significance, but simply existing within it. And when he finally withdrew his hand, the movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were ensuring the connection remained even after contact ended. And Sophie did not retreat, did not pull away, her presence unchanged, and that alone held his attention longer than anything else. And Roman straightened slightly, his posture returning, but not as rigid as before, not as distant. And when he looked at Elena, his gaze carried something that had not been there when she first arrived, not suspicion, not evaluation, but recognition. And when he spoke, his voice reflected that shift, quieter, more measured. "You did not just help her," he said. And Elena met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her answer simple. She helped herself. And the distinction settled between them again, reinforcing what had been building all along, that this was not something given, it was something chosen, and Roman felt that truth settle deeper than before, because it changed the way he saw everything that had happened. It reframed the progress not as something fragile, but as something rooted in Sophie's own will, and that understanding carried a different kind of strength, one that did not rely on constant control, one that could endure. And Roman turned his attention back to Sophie once more, taking in the quiet steadiness of her presence, the absence of the distance that had once defined every moment. And for the first time he allowed himself to consider something he had avoided entirely, the possibility that she might not just survive this, but move beyond it. And that thought did not bring the sharp edge of fear it once would have. It brought something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of belief, and he did not push it away, did not suppress it. He allowed it to exist, however uncertain, however unfamiliar. And as the room settled further into calm, as the quiet stretched without tension, Roman stepped back, his movements unhurried, his gaze lingering for a moment longer before shifting to Elena again. And there was no command this time, no instruction, only a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them without words, because he understood now that what she had brought into this house was not something he could replace, not something he could replicate through control. And as he turned to leave, his hand pausing briefly at the door once more, he realized that the change he had been resisting was no longer something external. It had taken root within him as well, and that realization did not unsettle him the way it once would have. It grounded him. And as he stepped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him, the silence that greeted him no longer felt like something to manage. It felt Like something that had finally begun to heal, morning did not arrive with urgency anymore. It unfolded slowly through the tall windows, carrying a softness that had been absent from the house for far too long. And Roman stood in the doorway once more, not out of habit this time, but out of intention, because the room beyond no longer felt like a place he needed to monitor. It felt like a place he chose to enter. And that distinction settled into him with quiet certainty as he stepped inside, his gaze immediately finding Sophie. And the difference was undeniable, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real, because she was awake before Elena spoke, her eyes open, her focus faint but present. And when Elena greeted her, there was a pause, a moment where the room seemed to wait, and then Sophie responded, not with a word fully formed, but with something closer than before, a sound that carried intention. And Roman felt it more than he heard it, a shift that resonated deeper than anything that had come before, because this was not just presence. This was participation, however fragile, however incomplete, and he remained still, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, because he understood now what he had not before, that forcing it would only break it. And Elena did not react with surprise, did not elevate the moment into something fragile. She simply acknowledged it with a quiet steadiness, as if she had always expected it to come, and that quiet confidence held Roman's attention longer than anything else, because it meant she had seen something he had not, something that existed beyond the visible signs he had relied on. And as Sophie's gaze shifted slightly, lingering for a second longer on her father than it ever had, Roman felt something inside him settle into place, something that no longer resisted the change but accepted it. And he stepped closer, not with authority, not with urgency, but with a presence that was finally aligned with the moment. And when he spoke, his voice carried something entirely different, something softer, something that did not demand but invited. Good morning. And Sophie's fingers moved again, not reaching, not clinging, but responding. And that was enough, more than enough, because it confirmed what had been building all along, that she was not just staying, she was returning. And Roman allowed himself to stand there, to exist in that reality without trying to control it. And for a moment the room held a quiet balance, something fragile yet grounded, something that had taken time to build and could not be rushed. And when he finally looked at Elena, his gaze no longer carried uncertainty or evaluation, it carried clarity. And when he spoke again, his words were deliberate, not rushed, not calculated, but chosen with care. You stayed when you did not have to, he said. And Elena met his gaze with the same calm she had always carried, her answer simple. So did she. And the meaning settled into him with a quiet weight, because it reframed everything once more, not as something given, not as something owed, but as something chosen. And Roman nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more than any command he had ever given. And he stepped back slightly, not withdrawing, but allowing the space to remain intact. And for a moment there were no words, no instructions, just the quiet presence of three people connected by something that had not existed before. And then Roman spoke again, his voice lower, more personal, something that belonged not to the man he had built himself into, but to the man who had been waiting beneath it. This house is not what it was, he said, not as a statement of loss, but as a recognition of change. And Elena did not respond immediately. She simply glanced at Sophie, then back at him, her expression steady. And Roman continued, the words forming without the structure he was used to, without the precision that had defined him for so long. And neither am I. And the admission settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forced, but real. And for the first time it did not feel like something he needed to correct or conceal. It felt like something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. And he took a breath, steady and controlled, but no longer guarded. And when he spoke again, the weight of his words did not come from authority. It came from intention. I built everything to keep her alive, he said, his gaze shifting briefly to Sophie, then returning to Elena. But you gave her a reason to stay. And Elena held his gaze without interruption, without deflection. And in that moment there was no hierarchy between them, no division of roles, just an understanding that passed quietly. And Roman stepped closer once more, his attention moving between them before settling fully on Elena. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the final shift, the one that could not be undone. "Stay," he said, not as an order, not as a command, but as something else entirely, something that carried both request and promise, not as staff, not as a temporary solution, but as part of this. And the words lingered in the air, simple but unmistakable, and for a moment nothing moved, nothing changed, and then Sophie's fingers shifted again, a small, quiet motion that drew both of their attention, and Roman looked down, his gaze softening in a way he no longer resisted, because he understood now what that meant. And when he looked back at Elena, there was no uncertainty left, only clarity, because he was no longer asking out of need alone. He was choosing, and that choice carried everything he had learned, everything he had changed, everything he had become, and the room held that moment without rushing it, without breaking it. And in that stillness, something settled into place, something that did not need to be spoken again, because it had already taken root, and Roman remained there, not as a man defined by control, but as someone who had finally learned what it meant to hold on without forcing, to protect without closing off, and to recognize that sometimes the strongest thing he could do was simply stay.